So I just want to welcome everybody around the world, from Hong Kong to parts of Europe, to parts of North America, South America, the Caribbean, Africa, all over the world. And for those of you joining us on YouTube later on. So here's wishing us a wonderful time. So on behalf of the Society, I as President, Sylvia Cowenberg as immediate past President, Joyce Ferreira as Vice President, Clive Forrester Secretary, Joseph Farquharson Publications Officer, Renee Zuniga as Treasurer, and our two Executive Officers, Cora Belgrave and Sandra Evans. And we also welcome Professor Lise Weiner, another former president. So we have two Professors Emerita in our midst and two past presidents who are shining bright. She was at McGill University in Canada. She is the author and compiler of several books on her beloved Trinidad and Tobago, where she did her PhD in linguistics at UWI St. Augustine. Lise has written and produced varieties of English around the world, Trinidad and Tobago, Bad John's, Badgie, and Banknote Blue, essays on the social history of language in Trinidad and Tobago, and the tome, the Dictionary of the English/Creole of Trinidad and Tobago. She's the co-author and author of numerous journal articles and book chapters addressing topics such as multilingual code switching, use of Caribbean Creoles and hip-hop lyrics, botanical and fauna lexicography, language of cuisine, historical sociolinguistic development of TNT language and languages, ethnic lexis, health and medical terminology, orthographic standardization, folk etymology, reggae lyrics in North America, calypso language, language and literature, and teaching English to students in North America with a Caribbean background. Lise is also the editor of several historical novels and recordings, and as I said, a past president of our society in the 2002-2004 biennium. Lise, not so long ago, received a Distinguished Alumni Award from UWI, as well as the Frederick G. Cassidy Award for Distinguished Achievement in Lexicography or Lexicology from the Dictionary Society of North America. Today, Lise will talk to us about current challenges in Caribbean Creole lexicography. Welcome one and all, and I turn you over to our moderator, our secretary, Clive Forrester.
We're going to move right into Professor Weiner's presentation now, and she will be looking at challenges in Caribbean lexicography. Dr. Weiner, go right ahead, unmute your mic, and over to you. I think you're still muted. So just click unmute, and we should be able to hear you. No, we're not hearing you as yet. You're still muted.
Okay,
Good.
now you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Now, are you going to post the PowerPoint, or am I?
No, you could share it on your end, Lise.
Okay, it's not the right format.
Right. So you could share it from your end.
Okay.
And I will tell you how much time you have left.
Okay.
So
okay, I
whenever you're
can't
ready.
see anybody, so
That's fine. We can see you very clearly.
Okay, well, that's the important thing.
Yes.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank the Universities of the Caribbean and the Society for the Caribbean Linguistics, and especially President Joanne Ferreira, for honoring me with this opportunity to speak to you today. And I'd like to also say that this presentation is dedicated to the memory of the late Hans Boos, who is a BFF of the Dictionary of English Creole, Trinidad and Tobago. Examples here are mostly from Caribbean English Creoles, particularly Trinidad and Tobago, because that is the ones I know best, but the principles generally apply across regional language varieties, especially Creole languages. But all of them are subject to local, regional, and national considerations, sometimes quite local, sometimes quite regional. I've picked out 7 particular challenges. There are, of course, more. I'm going to talk first about attitudes towards vernaculars, lack of awareness of regional dictionaries, lack of online dictionary, etymological biases, polysemy and synonymy, change, and heritage. Some of these Peter has so ably referred to, particularly heritage. Okay, attitudes towards the vernacular, as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, that have been traditionally very negative. But since the 1970s, traditional negative valuations about Caribbean vernaculars have become slightly to significantly more positive depending on the country. And these are attitudes can be measured in areas such as increased use in literary works, increased use in educational settings, and more positive comments about usage, for example, in newspaper columns. There is, however, a tremendous lack of awareness of scholarly regional dictionaries, such as Alsop's Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage, Cassidy and LePage's Dictionary of Jamaican English, my own Dictionary of the English/Creole of Trinidad and Tobago, and Holman Schilling's Dictionary of Bahamian English. There is some greater awareness locally, that is in the Bahamas, of the DBE simply because it has had free accessibility as a PDF for years. Positive pride in language has resulted and continues to result in proliferation of online sites and self-published work by amateurs. See review by Lambert 2013. These are invaluable in that they report on new data, data that is not possible for one person to gather just in one place, and pointing to subtle differences and similarities between countries. However, the coverage is basically unreliable, uneven, and full of mistakes. Questioning the popularity of these amateur type dictionaries, one wonders if some people, that is native speakers, feel that academic research takes the fun or the cultural legitimacy out of the vernacular, that makes it inaccessible to speakers, that it destroys in-group privacy of language. And do some people feel that once a dictionary is done, it is all finished? And that means concomitantly that if the dictionary does not have a new word or a word that you think should be in it, that it is just outdated and not useful. These are all questions to keep in mind while doing lexicography anywhere, but particularly in the Caribbean. Lack of online dictionary access is a real problem. Publication agreements for the TT dictionary included providing a print copy for every school and library in the country. 10 years after that, how many are still in play? No idea. Teachers still give assignments, this is as of last year, without reference to proper resources. For example, a teacher will say, go home and find 10 words that come from French in Trini. There are no legal, legitimate, online, fully searchable database, free access Creole scholarly dictionaries in the Caribbean. The Dictionary of Bahamian English is available free online, but only in PDF. PDF possibilities are extremely limited in searching text rather than a relational database. You can see possibilities for database searches in the Oxford English Dictionary. For example, you should be able to say, I would like all the flora names with derivation from Spanish cited before 1900. It should be possible to do searches like that. Digital initiatives, we must always keep in mind as privileged people that access to adequate devices such as laptops, tablets, and smartphones and high-speed Wi-Fi is by no means universal. This is true in developed countries in education in general, and it is certainly true in the Caribbean, especially for school-aged children. At the moment, an ontological digital database of the Dictionary of the English Creole of Trinidad and Tobago is being prepared under the direction of Phaedra Mohammed at the UWITT Department of Computing and Information Technology. It is partially supported by UWI Research and Development Initiative funding, is requiring extensive negotiation with several parties, including the original publisher, is using paid and or credited student work as a foundation of this, and also unpaid work from linguists. We're used to that, right? The database should eventually be available free of charge with minimal fees for apps, for games, and so forth. With the pandemic, it's not clear how much longer it's going to take, but we hope it'll be available eventually. A continuing challenge in fieldwork and lexicographical work here is etymological bias, or perhaps I should say preference. We do need to redress the under-identification of non-European languages in Caribbean English Creoles. Farquharson's work on African lexis in Jamaican is an example of the kind of work that we need for all areas. But lack of resources on relevant languages, especially African and Amerindian, is a keepback. Problems can also arise from emotional or prestige partiality to particular languages. For example, in Trinidad, people sometimes prefer the spelling SOU, SOU to the spelling SU, SU for the Cooperative Savings Bank. The latter is sometimes accorded greater prestige by some because it is seen to relate to French. However, the word itself is really from several African languages, and the spelling in French Creole is misleading in this respect. Obviously, for French Creole, use of the word susu, it is even more important, I feel, to have a spelling that reflects an African origin. However, in the French Creole orthography that is being proposed, that it has been proposed, SOU, SOU would be the correct spelling. French origin has also been positive for the small citrus fruit, the Portugal, derived incorrectly from part égal French or French Creole pas égal, despite its clear derivation from the name of the country and use in many languages. Bamboozle and frazzle are two words that are commonly ascribed to African sources, whereas they are both English. Another widespread regional problem, and in fact an international problem, is polysemy and synonymy. I'm going to talk now about 5 types of polysemy and synonymy, where one referent has several names in one country, one referent has different common names in different countries, one name can refer to several different referents within one country or among different countries. Source locality is frequently not provided or even collected, and this leads to an indiscriminate attribution across countries. There's also our old friend orthography variation in spelling intra and internationally. Here are several names for one referent in one country. Well, 3 examples. This plant here, known as both mini root and monkey gun, this plant as black sage and shining bush, and this plant as guan en buffet and seed underleaf. Interestingly, obviously, guan en buffet is French Creole, but it is also used by older English Creole speakers. These are names for this delicious seasoning plant. You can notice that there are 9 common names from 4 different languages. And the question is, how do you choose which one is going to be the one as chosen as the main entry? Here we have one referent, that is this tree, Cecropia peltata, with different names in different countries. And you can see there are a lot. Some of them are similar, like trumpet tree and bois trompette, but it's kind of a little bit slapdash. Then we have one name for several references in one country. So man better man applies to at least 2 plants in Trinidad. Here again, the source locality is not always provided, so that Christophene you will commonly find in, say, a cookbook or a guidebook, that other common names are chocho, chayote, and squash, but only Christophene is used in Trinidad and Tobago. Spanish names are more widespread, especially in English, because of the diasporic populations in the United States through signs and cookbooks. Variation in spelling. These are two very nice pictures of Chardon Béni and Chardon Béni, taken recently in Trinidad. And people have their own ideas and preferences about how to spell it. I have addressed this in an article, but it's very hard to enforce orthography. Now I'd like to talk about change, which is something that Peter referred to when he said that his current students could not believe, or people in Grenada could not believe, that the tapes he was playing were from Grenadians. This is a common problem. If you consider it a problem, I consider it a problem, that whereas in standard English metropoles, you are expected, if educated, to be able to handle Shakespeare, which is definitely different English. In Trinidad and Tobago, especially in Trinidad, people will not accept anything older than 5 minutes as current, and that it must be something from Tobago or from Jamaica or from Guyana. And people have very little idea of the dynamics of change in lexicon, where things are coming from, where they're going, and how they spread. I would say that right now, the biggest source of, well, let me just go through here. The first one is scientific name change. When I was working on the names for butterflies, I contacted a number of entomologists and about common names, and many of them scornfully replied that they would not deal with common names because scientific names were unchanging and therefore much better. I would like to point out that this tree, Maclura tinctoria, known commonly in Trinidad as fustic, has been given 7 species names in 4 genera, and that of the 1,143 species of flora with common names in Trinidad, about 20% have had their scientific names changed at least once. So don't believe scientists when they tell you that names are unchanging. They're changing all the time, and in fact, they're changing more frequently now with genetic research. Addition by borrowing. This is a common method. I'm looking here at an example of herbal medicines. An increasing popularity of herbal medicines combined with a decreasing local knowledge tends to lead to reliance on herbals of varying reliability from various territories. This is an example of some held by the UETT herbarium. This has been going on for a long time. For example, in the Calypso West Indian Weed Woman, sung by Bill Rogers and recorded in 1934, you see a number of plants referenced: man piaba, uman piaba, tantan, fallback, and lemongrass, and so forth. But these have different names in Trinidad. As you can see, some of them related, like tantan fallback and tantan foulback. You could investigate that. But bitter tally and waku are not clearly linguistically related. There is a big increase in the import of medicinal bush from Guyana. You can see it sold on the street in Port of Spain, for example, into TNT, and this leads to import of names. We also have addition by coinage or extension. I'm pleased to point out that we now have a star and an exoplanet for our solar galaxy system that were officially given TNT names as submitted by our own president. There's also revival or recovery. There's often a spike in popularity when a particular word is used in a song, a salient context, or by a celebrity. For instance, the use of deputy in 1982 was spiked by a very popular calypso by that name. It was previously cited in 1975, and it was probably around, but these spikes have now increased the popularity permanently. There are also spikes with an ethno-linguistically in-group word going into the wider population. So for example, Nimakaram, a Bhojpuri word for ungrateful, came to prominence around 2011, both in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, through a series of political speeches and referral. There's also loss, something that is very close to the heart of lexicographers and regretted. Some reference just naturally become obsolete or archaic. And there's nothing wrong with that. That happens. Culture changes, language changes. For instance, the cabildo, a form of government in Trinidad under the Spanish, is now totally obsolete. We don't have any cabildos, but it is obviously used in historical context. Regionally, crown colony government was a term that was once used more extensively and still historically. Many names of foods, sweets, dances, and other cultural items have become less familiar after World War II. Some have recently been revived via conscious cultural resuscitation. And I'm thinking of the resurgence, for example, of paradise plums in Trinidad, which were completely unknown after the war and then came back in the 1990s. There's also replacement from a more international or standard variety. Great numbers of flora and fauna names are no longer in use. And there's often replacement by an international or scientific name encouraged by many scientists, educators, tourists, and tour guides. And you can understand why this is the case. I mean, I remember once being up at the Acerite Nature Center in Trinidad and talking with some bird watching tourists, and they said, "Oh, that is just beautiful, that bird." And I said, "Yes, that's a semp." And they said, "No, actually, it's a violaceous euphonia." Now, I'm perfectly willing to accept that violaceous euphonia is one of its names, but locally, it should be called a semp. Shift. These are just 3 examples of words I've found, or phrases lately, where there's been a real semantic bleaching. For example, in a recent novel set during the 1950s, several times the expression "bad like jazz" is mentioned. Now, it's really bad like yaws, which was a widespread disease at the time, thankfully now no longer to be found. In this historical context, I feel that speakers at the time would have absolutely known this, and that for accuracy, it should be bad like yaws. I don't know how you can enforce that, except maybe by asking authors to be more diligent about reading dictionaries. Another expression, "rain can't wet me." Citations from a 1938 recording clearly give this as an example of macho boasting. You know, you can't, it's a stick fighting refrain, you can't hurt me. But recent oral citations and protests from young speakers interpreted this as fragility. As example, if rain wets, she get the cold one time. And they were not allowing for any other, quote, interpretations, quote. And I think that we have to be a little bit more rigorous about interpretations and a little more open about change. The international audience is also responsible for the decreasing use of the expression estate house, used in Trinidad and Tobago for the owner's house on an agricultural property, now commonly replaced with great house, big house, and plantation house, mostly used in other Caribbean countries and the United States. I'm not sure what kind of legislation we need about this, if any, but it should be tracked. Heritage. There is a movement to recover heritage. This is particularly difficult in a tropical environment where paper is so fragile, but we have a real problem with recovering heritage. Newspapers of the region, there are few on microfilm and fewer that are digitized, but there are some. There are original copies, sometimes missing, but very limited access. You can sit in the archives and National Archives in Trinidad and read the papers there for hours, but you'll have to read it page by page. Botanical specimen sheets are not always available. A lot of them are housed in England, and they are being digitized, thank goodness. Cited literature is not always available. It's not always possible to find something in Trinidad that has been published, that was originally published there, or even in the UK. And when you do find something online, it's not always free. It may be available to people with university connections, but not to others. Some depositories are really making efforts to improve their heritage holdings. For example, university and national libraries in the Caribbean and institutions such as the Institute of Jamaica, the Archives of Trinidad and Tobago, and the National Library of Trinidad and Tobago. Extensive document holdings, private collections, photographic holdings, recordings. Recordings are not only good for oral language and as citation dates, but photographs can be used as fieldwork elicitation aids, and that has proved very helpful for me, for example, in the study of the East Indian vocabulary. There are expanding holdings at the Digital Library of the Caribbean at the University of Florida, Gainesville, including texts and recordings, and they have totally open deposition and online access. So this is where to put your field notes, your transcripts, your texts that you don't know what to do with, or you don't have time to do with. They can go somewhere where people can look at them. Recovered literatures are now a thriving business, I'm happy to say. Edited, annotated volumes of lost literature from throughout the Caribbean, and here are some examples. And I'll just put in a plug for a new one that will be coming out, edited by Professor Bridget Brereton and myself, on 2 19th century plays from Trinidad and Tobago. These are absolutely wonderful sources of language citations. Recovered lyrics. There has been quite a bit of work done with the Decca Records collection, especially with the calypsos recorded in the 1930s and 40s, and the Archives of Traditional Folk Music at Indiana University, which is the holder now of the recordings of Melville and Francis Herskovits that Peter mentioned from their fieldwork in Trinidad in 1939, and from other recordings, oral interviews, sound recordings, song recordings from across the region. In conclusion, I'd like to suggest some strategic strategies. One is to develop an integrated and cooperative regional lexical database. This does not mean it has to be one database for the whole region, but some kind of sharing of format and information among regional databases. To conduct extractive research in public and university libraries and archives and private collections. We have places to put this stuff now, and these are excellent assignments for students in the various countries. We need to deposit and exploit unpublished text, recordings, lexicographic items, and citations. We need to set up continuing monitoring of social media and online resources, a job for the younger generation, I'm sure. And we need to involve both public and students in supervised usage surveys. And that's some references here, and that's what I have to present to you today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lise. So you could minimize your screen now. You could minimize your...
I am trying to figure out how to minimize it.
Okay, right. Well, or you could just close your PowerPoint. I have it here. I have it open on my end. So that's not a problem. So we were able to see the slides, and we're able to see some of the pictures.
This is why I need my younger relatives.
No, you're doing fine. You're doing fine. All right. So I'm going to ask Joseph to come in because actually we have a little bit of time, Joseph. I think we have maybe 8 minutes left in Lisa's presentation segment. So Joseph, if you want, you could add a little bit onto your discussion segment if you wish. That's up to you.
8 minutes.
that is perfectly fine. So Joseph, go right ahead. Unmute your mic and go right ahead, Joseph.
Okay.
Joseph, just before you start, Joseph, I see that we have somebody who is waiting in the in the room. We have Dr. Hazel Simmons McDonald, who is waiting in the waiting room. I'm going to let her in, and she's just going to view the presentation. I think she was trying to view it on Facebook, but I sent her the link nonetheless.
Joseph, can I ask if you are on the exoplanet Dingolay with that background?
No, it's Ramajay.
Oh, it's Ramajay. I'm sorry. It is so hard to tell from outer space.
All right, so thanks very much, Lise. I'm not going to use the time because people didn't come to hear me. They came to hear you. So I think we should give you as much time as possible. Excellent presentation, a whole lot pressed into, you know, a very short time. And in fact, you kind of dealt with much of the history of Anglophone Caribbean lexicography and the lexicography of other varieties too, that have many of the same issues. So I just wanted to start out with the main thing, and I think this is what is going to be foremost in the minds of also younger lexicographers. So if we take, for example, the Oxford English Dictionary with a massive team, well, it was a smaller team when they started out, but it grew and they had funding, but it took more than 50 years. And so one of the things with lexicography is this prohibitive length of time that it takes to put together a lexicographic work. So what I wanted to hear from you first was a very personal account of the length of time it took to put together the TT dictionary and what was going through your mind over all of those years.
Okay, am I supposed to be able to see you? Clive, I'm seeing the procedure.
Oh, Clive probably put it up for a brief.
Yes, so can you see him now? Right.
Right, well, I have many times been asked, how long did it take you to do that? And the short answer is 30 years. Basically, I was working by myself. Now, the nice thing about dictionaries, as people have pointed out, is it's a piece of work where when you're doing a single dictionary like that as an editor, you're doing it totally and completely by yourself. At the same time, you cannot do it inherently without the help of many, many other people. And I would like to say that it was not easy, and it took me a long time because it was always fitted into the corners of my paid employment, which was never to work on the dictionary. I got pretty much no financial support for that. There were little bits here and there. I think the if I were to give people some hints about how to maximize financial efficiency, it would be to be really organized and divide up the workload amongst different people. Students are fantastic. Students are keen, and the linguistic students at UE are prepared. You know, when you go in there and do a little workshop with them, they are on top of it. So I think that using students and closely supervised workshops with them is key. And anyway, I'm sure I didn't answer your question, so perhaps a follow-up.
You did, because I wanted the very personal response. Now you spoke about, I'm trying to frame it, that you pretty much worked on your own, but not by yourself. And I understand fully well. And that leads to my next question about, it's impossible for the lexicographer to be an expert in all of the areas that words are drawn from. And so what was your experience working with different scholars on the dictionaries, your entomologists, your zoologists, and carnival people?
But that was really the most fun part for me. And one of the things I discovered was that although I don't have a deep knowledge in many areas, I have a good general knowledge in a lot of areas, and particularly natural sciences. So I would just, if I could, I would find somebody to introduce me to somebody who did bush baths or who was a school teacher, you know, somebody that I could talk to, or I would just sit on people's galleries and talk. But I have to say that I loved talking to specialists. And I would say specialists rather than scholars, because a specialist could be someone who is involved in cockfighting, for example. And I can't say that I enjoyed that particular research very well, but it was a good example of what happens if you've got anthropological training, that people in several areas, several specialists became literally my best friends. And people, if you're in the one place long enough, people will say, oh, I have something for you, right? And they didn't have to be a scholar. In fact, I would sometimes say to scholars, so what is the scientific name of this wasp? And they say, it doesn't matter. It's one of the hornets. And I'm thinking, I want to know which one it is. And I would sometimes ask a farmer, so which one is that? And he would at least be able to distinguish between two kinds. So you have to take your knowledge from the people who have it. And I found that if you just walk in cold and say, hello, I'd like to learn something about bush medicine, people would just completely brush you off, right? It's like, oh yeah, well, we used to have that, but we ain't have that again. And I think, okay, but if I come in and say, oh, excuse me, hello, I see you have shining bush in your yard, you all could give me some? Then you got off on a totally different foot. And I cultivated my people. I tracked down scholars in all kinds of areas. I went to visit sugar mills, cocoa estates. I mean, there wasn't carnival mass camps. There wasn't the kind of place that there was for specialist vocabulary that I didn't try to get into. I loved that.
All right, great. So what you did is historical lexicography, or lexicography
Yes.
on historical principles,
Right.
which doing it myself, I know was the main problem, because you're trying to trace the history of each word for thousands of words.
Right.
That takes a while. But with historical lexicography, doing that in what is largely an oral culture presents particular challenges, I assume. So could you just elaborate a bit on what some of those challenges were? You could speak specifically to the TT dictionary and how you overcame them. Now, I think I know, but I'm asking for the benefit.
Oh, I'm sure that you know. It doesn't take long to figure out that your biggest friend and your biggest enemy is spelling, okay? And the thing is, when you look at older Trinidad texts, by older, of course, I don't mean like Barbados and Jamaica. I mean like, you know, early 19th century for Trinidad. When you look at that, you realize that it didn't sound then exactly the way it does now. And I would say that the biggest change in language in Trinidad occurred during the Second World War with the influx of Americans and more schools and television and so forth. But that the next big change occurred more recently, when people have very little sense of how people used to talk. And people would constantly say, oh, you should speak to my grandmother because she knew that. Well, the grandmother is dead, or the grandmother is not willing to talk, or lives in someplace else. And people, there's this like mythical language that existed at some point, and it had lots of African things in it. And it's just like in Tobago or Jamaica or Guyana, or these other places where romantically people have an idea that there's a golden age of language, that if you could just go far enough into the country, you could find it.
Yes.
And there are two things that save you, right? One, of course, is writing. For an oral language, Caribbean Creoles have a lot of writing. And you just have to look for it, and you have to find it. You can, it's not always rich ore, but writing in dialect was very popular during the 19th century, in English as well. So I think that the newspapers have not been exploited as much as they have been. Also, when you look at them enough, one of the nice things about texts is they don't talk back, they don't have to go for lunch, they don't have to do anything, they're right there, right? And you can look at them at your leisure. And if you try reading them aloud, you will soon find certain regularities, both of the language itself and the representation of the language. And you have to have some understanding of how English or French writers would represent those sounds that they were hearing, which were not really words they knew. The recordings are also wonderful. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. The word gangan in Trinidad and Tobago means grandmother, usually. And everybody thinks it's from French, right? There is, okay, I'm not seeing you. There is a French etymology for that, but in an old recording from 1939 from the Herskovitz collection, they were singing a song about Ngangan. I see me Ngangan, which is clearly African. Clearly, I mean, you don't have an initial NG in French. So sometimes you can go back, and with that, you have a lot more options. But I think that people will see that it was written either deliberately in a dialect style, like columnists, but also not just for educated people to laugh at. The labor union newspapers of the 30s, for example, have huge amounts of dialect columns that I've been kind of publishing on and off, and they're wonderful for this. Wonderful.
Okay, I was hoping that you would have, you brought it up slightly, briefly, but didn't go into it. I was hoping that you would have mentioned music.
Oh, well, that's what I mean by recordings.
Yes, and you did say
Gangan was from a song.
Okay, I thought you meant
I'm sorry. Other people's transcriptions are never totally reliable.
Oh.
And one of the things that I've done with a group of people, a whole bunch of calypsos, hundreds of calypsos, and folk recordings. And the Herskovitz recordings are a whole bunch of different kinds of songs, folk songs, this, that, the other thing, African Orisha songs, Shango songs. And there's more out there than you might think. Alan Lomax recorded hundreds and thousands of songs from the Caribbean. And, a song will go back farther than a living person's memory. So they are absolutely invaluable. And sometimes you have to work out now, what was that originally, as opposed to what is it now? Yeah.
So thanks for that. You had mentioned, but you keep on bringing up African words of African origin. You mentioned 2 words of Indian origin.
Yeah.
How did you, in your work, overcome etymological bias?
Okay, well, the first thing was to gather words from the East Indian community. And I did that also by reading, right? It's amazing what you can learn by reading. And then I also worked very closely with a number of East Indian Trinidadians. Some were just my friends or were specialists in some area. And when you get to be friends with somebody, you go to their house and you go to the market on Sunday morning, and then you come back and cook for people. You learn all kinds of new vocabulary, but it's 1-1, 1-1, right? Now, I also worked with an East Indian family, not in a rural area, in 10 minutes from the university in El Dorado, off the Eastern Main Road, with a family who was willing, God bless them, to sit and listen to me ask them word lists. I mean, people think that word lists are great, but you know, most people after about 3 words,
Yes.
they're ready to call that George, right? And I cannot thank them enough for their patience and the skill with which they disentangled words that you could only use when you're speaking Hindi or words that you could use in an English sentence. And that was just invaluable. Now, I have to say that when it came time to doing the etymologies, I was lucky enough to find a graduate student where I was teaching who was a native speaker of Bhojpuri, not even Hindi, but Bhojpuri or Hindi. And he went through the entire Oxford Hindi-English dictionary looking for possible etymons. I also made friends with the mother of a colleague of mine here who had nothing to do with linguistics, but they were native Bhojpuri speakers and felt very, they cherished it. So I would go over to their house, and I have to say that it was kind of boring, and it was not, you know, it was not all thrills and chills, and you had to be very, very polite and listen all the time. But trying to tease out from them was very important. It was very important for that. So I feel very confident that the dictionary has a good representation of all the ethnic groups that have contributed to the country. Now, I have to say that I was really looking for some Latvian Creole because Tobago was a colony of the Duchy of Courland, now part of Latvia, for some period of time, but I was never able to find anything. So that's my grail. I'm still looking for a piece of Latvian, Anglo-Tobagonian Creole.
All right, this is going to be an inside joke for me and you, Lise. But
okay, I can't see you.
Clive?
Yes.
This is going to be an inside joke between me and you. But I'm sitting here listening to you, and somebody signs in on the chat called James Murray.
James Morris.
Murray.
Do you know that name, James Murray?
Might take a while.
I'm
Oxford English Dictionary.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Well.
I mean,
that's who I thought of first, but I wouldn't have expected. This is really, not only are we international, we're intergalactic.
Yeah. And between the dimensions. So, James Murray, everybody, was one of the early editors of the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yes.
James, thanks for bringing that little twist to our discussion today.
We're just right now approaching the question and answer segment from the general public, and I'd just like to acknowledge that a few persons have joined in since we've been going on here. I see Professor Michelle de Graaf is in the house, joining all the way from MIT. Big up yourself, Prof. I see Kathy Ann is here, Carlos Rodriguez, James Murray, and Hazel Simmons McDonald is also here. If you don't mind, Joseph, I'd like to know if any of them have a question before you go on with your question, Joseph.
Okay.
If any of them have a question, you've been listening in. For those of you who joined halfway through or however long, if you have a question, feel free to unmute your mic and you can ask a question. I see that Professor Michelle de Graaf, you have unmuted your mic. Do you have a question or a comment or reflection, even on your own time doing field research or lexicographic work, whatever it is? Feel free, go ahead.
All right, so good to see you all. It's good to see Liz that I've been seeing forever. Good to see everyone. Peter, Joanne, Joseph, Clive. It's so good to see you all. Okay, so I won't spend so much time saying hello because I could do just that for an hour. But Liz, I have a question for you. So so I'm very inspired by what you're doing, and it's kind of sobering, but also encouraging to hear that it's taken you 30 years to get to where you are now. And so in the past, maybe 5 years or so, 8 years, we have this project at MIT promoting the teaching of science and math in Creole. And we've done workshops in Haiti. We have a platform where we're gathering materials from teachers. It involves lots of co-creation. And very often, so in physics and math and biology and chemistry, we have to sometimes create new terms, and sometimes we borrow terms from French. Sometimes it makes more sense to get a term from English. Sometimes we have to take a French word and then change the meaning a bit to make it fit a particular concept in say in physics. And as we're doing so, we're collecting them online. So we have a glossary online that's very interactive, very dynamic, where we keep updating the entries. But what we find is that from certain quarters, even including from linguists in Haiti, there is some resistance to this process, right? They feel that dictionaries have to be more formal. So there's a sense that, well, if we collect terms the way we're doing it, very organically, very basically bottom up, then it's not the best way to go about it. It might actually hurt the students if they're using terms that are not quote unquote correct, that we have to respect the purity of the language. So it's a challenge because some of these folks are very vocal. They go into newspapers and make certain claims against this process. So I wanted to hear a bit of your wisdom around these issues, and what do you think as someone who's been doing that for years now? So what's your take?
Well, one of the differences, of course, between the greater Francophone milieu and the greater Anglophone milieu is that English people don't like to have rules about language, right? We don't have an academy. The Francophone milieu is much more used to the idea of there being an academy that sets down a rule. Now, you might be able to use that to your advantage. I don't know how many people are on board, and I know from looking at the history of the establishment of orthography for patois, it's not an easy thing, and there are still people who will fight to the death about OU versus you,
Yeah.
And I'm in the process of moi apprendre patois maintenant, and I'm as you can see getting interference from French, and the Haitians that I speak to will not allow me to say moi tini. I have to say moi gagnant. So there's a lot of problems within the language itself. But I would say that if you have some kind of systematic set of principles that you can say, okay, here are the 9 principles we're using. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We use English for this, we use French for this, we use Latin for this. If this is very, very popular and people know it already, we use it like this. If there's been citations like this. So that you have to have a kind of a grill of principe that you can look at. And people may not agree with them, right? But they will respect that and take it as if you have thought about it. And you're not doing this randomly or just by your own personal preference. That's one thing I would suggest.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I'm going to allow another 10 minutes in the Q&A segment. I think we started about 10 minutes late. So if there's anybody else to say, Marisol joining in. ¿Cómo está, Marisol? Joining in from Puerto Rico. Carlos, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question, Carlos? Go right ahead. Just, unmute.
Okay, hello everyone. This is Carlos. I'm originally from Puerto Rico as well, but I now work at the University of Aruba. I've been here for 2 years now. Some of you know me, some of you don't, so that was simply my introduction. And I had posted a question on the chat for Professor Peter Roberts. Nice to hear from you again, Professor Roberts. In terms of field work and how it has changed over the past few decades, I'm interested in this whole issue brought about by the IRB process I find that there's a lot of young researchers who are actually not wanting to go into fieldwork, or they feel discouraged from going into fieldwork because, at least in our university, there are all these requirements about consent, and everything has to be reviewed by this, pre-approved by this board before you go forward. And if you make any changes at the last minute, which is bound to happen in real life-to-life interaction, you also have to take those changes to them, and they have to reapprove it before you give it to the participants. Participants themselves can balk at having to sign something formal, you know, that they have to read. And I think that's something, it seems to me, I don't know, I'm asking you, right, that has changed within the last decade or so. And I'm wondering if you have some reflection on how you have seen this as a positive or perhaps not so positive development. I understand the spirit of this is to bring ethics to the table, and I support that, but it may have some consequences in terms of participation and in terms of willingness of researchers to go into fieldwork as opposed to something more comfortable that they can do at home using text. Could you perhaps comment on that, you or anybody else, perhaps? Thank you very much. I'll mute my microphone.
It never affected me. Hello, Michelle. It never affected me. And I see the problems that it will cause. I don't know, political correctness is part of the modern era. I don't know that you can do anything about it. It is a big problem if it is going to prevent you from asking your neighbor a question and then you can't use it to say anything. I don't really have any answer to what can be done.
Yeah.
Well,
I think I could chime in on what Carlos was asking, maybe just a little bit of information, Carlos. A lot of these ethics approval, at least the way that I conceptualize them, are meant to protect the informant, right? Especially if the person is a minor, especially the person belongs to a vulnerable community. You know, given that we are taking this information and we're going to publish it in a journal, and some of the ways that we solicit this information are by asking informants to give personal stories, right? Because anybody who has ever done research knows that it's not useful to go to a participant, an informant, and ask them, so tell me, how do you conjugate the verb in this language? You know, how do you form the past tense in this particular? That's useless. It's more useful to say, tell me about your life in this community. And those stories might be very personal. You might get sensitive information. I can tell you about a time, one of my earliest field research experiences was in Guyana. And Joseph was there at the time, and Joseph and I were doing research in Guyana. I was investigating the kinds of duppy stories that exist in Guyana. And Joseph wanted something about pronouns, so he just tagged along, right? And I remember we went to a house, and this was maybe like 12 p.m., like about 1 o'clock, lunchtime. And I was asking these people in Guyana, so tell me a duppy story. This is 1 o'clock, you know, the boiling sun hot. You know, tell me a duppy story. And what a waste of time. What had to happen was that Joseph and I started to tell them our duppy stories from Jamaica. Joseph and I started to sing. We start dance, and like 5 hours later, we're tired and we got maybe 2 duppy stories later on. And a lot of these ethics, you know, approvals and the hoops that we have to jump through are intended to protect the informants. Who knows what they're giving of themselves, and we need to ensure that we use it in a responsible way. I said, Deidre, you have your hand up, and then I'll go to Lise. So Deidre, just unmute, and then I'll go right to Lise.
Yes, Clive, I just wanted to add to what you said about the protection, especially since many of these communities already feel as if they have been used over and over and over and over, right? And therefore, without those kinds of protections, it's like you're allowing just about anybody to come in and take what it is that they want. And
right.
So the protection of the community secrets is a big thing as well, because you never know what can come out in a discussion with an informant, and there has to be something in place. So I understand that it might seem frustrating at times, but the reality is that if you find out what needs to be done early and start the process, then it shouldn't be a problem. I remember an incident in one of the communities, because Professor Devonish had spoken to one informant before I went into the field. So the community I stayed in, I started going to that informant and just having conversations with her. And the Tusho, it was another outsider who came to me and said that the Tusho is very offended because I came into the community and I didn't see it as a problem, because I guess at the time I didn't fully understand the extent to the structure that they had, that I did not speak to her before I started interact. Not that she needed anything written, but to even come to her and talk to her about me going around the community. So, you know, I had to just go and butter her up a bit after that to ensure that I could continue my field work.
Yes,
right?
yes,
But
yes.
those things are in place for a good reason.
All right, Lise, and then Joseph.
Yes, I have to say that I have a very personal connection to inappropriate research. My late father was a subject in the infamous Stanley Milgram obedience experiments at Yale many, many years ago. And that was what kicked off a lot of the move towards ethical review of experiments. So what I found in my research was that there were two sides to this. One, as you just mentioned, is convincing your informants to talk to you. And I think that there's no substitute for telling them what you're doing, which is, and you have to prove that. This is not just a come in one time and leave, right? You have to prove over a period of time that you are trustworthy, and that if they tell you something secret, that it won't get repeated. The other side is the university side, and that I found was actually easier. We developed protocols where I had to explain to people from the psychology department that we were not doing experimental research, that we were doing ethnography. Your best allies are people in anthropology and history, but that we would say, I will get verbal consent, you know. I cannot ask people to sign anything. Now, in the Caribbean, people, it may be different with some minority groups, but certainly in Trinidad or Jamaica, people are not a captive population. They are not prisoners. They are not children. So when people agree to talk to you, they're going to talk to you as much as they're willing to. And you have to be able to prove to them, that you are trustworthy. If you are not, they won't talk to you.
Thank you very much. Joseph, and then I think Joanne, well, so Joseph, then Marisol. For persons who are in the Zoom chat and you'd like to ask a question, there's a raise hand feature. If you click your name, you should be able to raise your hand as well. So Joseph, Marisol, and then I think Joanne, you have a few questions from Facebook. We'll go to those questions. So Joseph, then Marisol. Go ahead, Joseph.
But also having a good sense of the community and your own personal responsibility to protect the members of the community who have decided to share with you. And a part of that understanding is that when you go in, you don't really understand their universe. They don't understand yours either. So when you walk in and say, okay, could I get your information? It's going to be a part of a study that I'm going to publish in a journal. I mean, this doesn't say much to anybody. And so I go into Canada to do work on Jamaicans in Canada. And this man is talking to me and he's giving me details about his immigration status at the time he came. And I'm like, okay, you know, could we leave that out? You know, the responsibility is on me then to omit that from my from my corpus when I come to study it, so it doesn't get out there, because I don't know, how many years afterwards something like that could haunt him.
Right. Thanks for that, Joseph. Marisol, go right ahead. Click unmute and just ask your question. Oh, you're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Yes. It's fantastic to see all of you and to share in linguistics here in the Caribbean. Hi, Carlos. You're no longer here, but we're doing the same things. With this informed consent, I hate it. I hate it because we have to go over months and months of documents before we get the permit to go into the field. But once you do it, well, you're fine. In my experience and going into my own community and how the people in my community receive this informed consent, they're like, but you're part of us. What you want that for? Or they're like, isn't the word good enough? So part of the old schedule I have to introduce, part of that, time for them to see me, for them to know me, for them to get familiarized with a piece of paper before I ask them for their consent. I have spent hours and hours and hours, and I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews that I cannot use because I didn't get their signature. Because anytime I show it to them or I would read it to them or, verbal consent and things like that. But at the end, they were like, you come from a university in the States and you want my signature. What you want my signature for? Then the experience they have with researchers from outside of the community, coming into the community, never asking for, any consent. And then I come into my community and ask for the consent and they're like, what going on here? Why is it you asking for this? And such a person didn't come do nothing like that. They want to turn on the thing and, take the picture and make the video. So going into my own community, I had to introduce into my schedule a lot of time to let them know what is it I'm doing, why is it I'm doing it, and where is the information going to end up, and then go back into the community and take the result of the research. I had to take my PhD dissertation house to house to show them, here it is, and they were happy. They didn't get a copy of it, that is expensive, but they saw it and we took pictures together and I showed them into my dissertation. You remember when you said this? I use it this, yes, but I don't see my name nowhere, no, because I'm protecting you. So it is very difficult, but it needs to be part of the equation. When we go into the field, especially we only have certain amount of money and certain amount of time. And we want, the first time I went to do that, and Dr. Faraklas, he laughed at me a lot because the first time I went to do research, I had this agenda. Every interview was half an hour and then 10 minutes to go to the other interview. And the first interview I had was with this older lady. She was 92 and she had me sitting down there for 4 hours telling me the story of her life. And I had to, change the whole thing and just sit down there with her and listen to her and record her. And then I would turn on the recorder and she's like, no, man, me no finish yet. Me no finish yet. And, wow. I had things to do, but I had to, respect her and respect her story and sit down there with her, So yes, it's difficult. And, in part of that equation, that 6 months of, getting the permit, Carlos, we need to introduce that into the equation, the amount of time that we're going to need to actually have a conversation with the members of the community before starting the work that we have to do.
Thank you very much, Marisol. Hazel, I'm going to allow you to ask your question, Hazel, and then we're going to go right to the questions from Facebook.
No. Oops. I'm trying to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. We're hearing you. We're hearing it clearly. Okay. Yes.
Just a very quick comment on the last point being discussed, and then I have a quick one for Peter and one for Lise. When in doing applied research, it was my experience that if you're working with younger younger informants, participants. They made it easy by simply saying for the ethics thing, you have to get permission to work with human subjects. And then you could go to the organization in charge of those subjects, like a Ministry of Education, for example, to get permission to work with them. But you had to use pseudonyms to protect the identity of the children you were working with. So that took away a lot of some of the challenges that you were discussing a little while ago and made it easier to go ahead with the research, because there was always the assurance that you were not ever going to expose a particular child so that that child would be recognized. So that was one of the pluses that I found in doing applied research. My quick question for Peter. Peter, I remember when you became head, when you were head, I joined the department at Cable when you were head. There was these complaints from students, graduate students, that they were like lone wolves, what you described, and they didn't want to do research like that, and they wanted the support. And that had led us to develop a suite of courses, postgraduate courses, including field research courses that would help them to go into the field with more confidence. You've done a lot of supervision since then, and I was wondering whether you thought that introduction and that work that was introduced then would have helped to minimize the kinds of concerns you experienced as a lone wolf. That's your question. And Lise, a very quick question for you. You make a distinction between, or the need for observing the rigorousness of interpretation, and yet being open to change. What kind of challenge does that present to the lexicographer? And with updating information, given the time lapse between preparing a first dictionary and then having to do, to take account of all the changes that happen naturally with language. So Peter and then Lise, thank you very much. And it's good to see everybody. Thank you.
Same to you.
Well, as I said in my talk, I think the students nowadays are much better prepared to do the research in the field. And they also have this research methods course that gives them like a path to follow. So it would have helped me a lot, yeah, certainly.
Lise, you could go ahead with your question.
Yes.
The question of how you update things, you know, it used to be that the OED rule was that unless a word had been around in writing for 10 years, you couldn't add it to the dictionary. And now that is not only not true that it doesn't have to be written, it doesn't have to be longer than about 10 or 15 minutes that it's around before it gets added. I think there are two things. One, you have to keep in touch. And this cannot be done in a desultory fashion. I'm now trying to deal with all the stuff that people write into me and say, do you have this? Do you have this? And I am hoping that within the parameters of the digitized dictionary, that if I give the royalties and the copyright and everything for me to UWI, that they can help set up some kind of a permanent structure that can handle that, and where I would then leave it up to the linguists in the department to supervise the updates. But I think there would always have to be a first edition and then a constantly updated digital edition. It's not easy to let go of, but you know, you have to, otherwise it just becomes static. And as I said, people like updated meanings. Of course, most of the new words coming into Trinidad and Tobago these days come from either the United States or Jamaica. So that's why it's necessary to have some oversight. You can't just pour everything in, because then you get what I talked about with the amateur dictionaries. You just get stuff that's not very, very reliable.
Thank you. Joan, could you just unmute your mic and give us the two questions from Facebook? We're going to be wrapping up shortly. So if you remember what those questions are, I think you posted them in the chat room.
I have them.
Okay.
Carrie Belgrave is asking Lise, How soon will the rapid developments / additions of Caribbean digital text jargon be included in future editions or revisions of Caribbean dictionaries?
As soon as we get it, as soon as we can put it in. I have no problem with that. If there's, she should let me know any if she has some.
Okay, I'll tell her. And I think this next question from Nicola Quito in Canada is for either Lise or Peter or both. Are reports on the use and success of English Creole accessible, especially with regard to students who continue their studies in Canada and the US?
Reports on what?
The use and success of English Creole by Caribbean students in Canada and the US. I'm not sure if he's asking if, let me see, if it's like courses on Jamaican that Clive is teaching in Waterloo and Harvard, or if he's asking whether English Creole speakers have success in English in North American universities. So I'm not actually sure. I think he's a French speaker. Let me see if I can ask him.
Right. Yeah. So I think he might. So I'm looking at the question now, and I think it might simply relate to information in general about these Creole languages, their usage, their popularization, whether or not they're being taught in university courses, whether or not this is accessible or easily accessible to people outside of the Caribbean region. How successful have we been at doing things like that? Peter and then Lise, maybe. How closely would you say we're able to achieve that?
Work that we have done is accessible, is that it?
Yeah, essentially. If you were going to give it a mark, how accessible would you say it is?
It will become more and more accessible when it's digitized, but now, where you have to come to the library and look at it, well, that's still the old-fashioned method.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that, Lise?
Yeah, it's there was some interest in this area between, say, 1975 and about 10 years ago. And there were a number of publications from people who were interested in the education of Caribbean background students in North America, a movement that started actually in England. And it is not easy to get that information. It's much easier to get information about the Caribbean, but Caribbean students in North America or UK, there's been some by, for example, by Chandel Nero has published works on how Caribbean background students do at the college level. Mm. So there is some stuff, but you have to really track it down. Yes. And right now, of course, nobody's interested. I would say that living here in Quebec as I do, the question is not whether anybody can learn English, but whether the Haitians can speak proper French. And, you know, there's a popular lashback on that, which I'm very pleased to see.
Thank you, Lise. Joseph, you have your hand up. You'd like to comment on that question as well. Go ahead.
Yes, I was going to speak from my own fieldwork in Canada. So I can't really speak much to the education system. The reports I got were that, you know, it's not used in education. So as Lise pointed out, there was some work in the 70s and I think probably to early 80s. Not much now. What I can speak to is use in the community and among friends, etc. Especially in Toronto, that for Caribbean Creole languages, they moved from a situation of being marginalized by the speakers themselves. Mm. So when they entered, because if we're looking at the 1960s, 70s, many people then would have gone with not so positive attitudes to Caribbean Creoles.
Right.
Yeah. But what happened is that they were joined by a later generation coming in the 80s and 90s who were going to North America with more positive attitudes. And the important thing about that later generation is that they had continuing access to the language, which their parents didn't. First through improvements in telecommunications, and then through the internet with internet forums, and then social media, etc. And so nowadays, somebody born in Canada to Jamaican parents, to Haitian parents, to Trinidadian parents, has much greater access to Caribbean Creole languages, to the extent that they do not have to rely on their parents. So even in situations where parents try to limit their children's exposure to the Creole language, now the children don't need them at all. They can get it on the internet and through music.
Definitely, that is definitely true. I had an experience years ago when I was at York University teaching Jamaican Creole. I encountered a few students, young students, first-year students, who confessed to me. They say, "Boy, sir, I can't tell my brother I'm doing this Jamaican Creole course, you know. She's going to say I'm wasting her money. Why me waste her money? I take Jamaican Creole when she can't hear Jamaican Creole at home, when she can't hear Patois at home." And she said, "But I want to do the course." So I said to her, "You know what you should do? You should invite me to dinner. Invite me to dinner so that I can come and we have a coming out party. I take Jamaican Creole and I'm proud." That is what I told those students to do, because as Joseph said, you know, a lot of these students, you know, they're first, second generation Caribbean nationals, and they feel cut off from their culture because their parents came to Canada, came to the US, came to the UK, and they just wanted to assimilate. They felt that the best gift that they could give to their children is for them to completely assimilate in this society and, you know, kind of cut off certain aspects of culture, when that is not what the children want. You know, they grow up and they have this yearning to reconnect.
How important peer interaction is for these languages. And so I sat at a family gathering, this was Thanksgiving in Canada, and listened to children, and this was for several hours, who I knew spoke some amount of Jamaican, speak not one word of it. And it was months after that I figured that it was because their grandparents and parents were within earshot. But you take them on, so the grandparents and parents are talking, they're switching between English and Jamaican. The parents are speaking Jamaican, but the children aren't daring, but on their own, they will do it. And so you find that it's pretty much a peer-to-peer code. I see Lise with her hand up.
Yes. Yes, Lise, you'd like to join in,
I'd like to support that. Here in Montreal, we have an interesting situation where Montreal has the largest number of people of Haitian descent outside of Haiti. And Haitians in Montreal, by the popular youth culture, are considered the coolest immigrants of any except the Jamaicans. The Jamaicans come out at the top of the cool quotient, partly because they're more associated with danger, okay? Whether that's fair or not. Anyway, but the youth of Quebec, don't forget, they are not allowed to go, immigrants are not allowed to go to English schools. So you have people, in the French schools, the emphasis is on some kind of weird standard French, which nobody really speaks except some people. And the popular reaction of youth is, all right, you want me to speak that kind of French? All right, fine, I'll do that if I have to. But you know what? Outside of school, I am not speaking that. I am speaking the way I want. And you know, my French includes English, Haitian, Jamaican, anything I want it to. And that is, the Montreal hip hop scene is amazingly multilingual. And when they want to impress somebody, they either switch the language themselves or they bring in a ringer. You know, we have one hip hop singer who's not really very good, and she tries to sing in Jamaican, but it's more like what we call Jafaican. And she is not well respected. But for instance, if somebody can't sing Jamaican themselves, they will bring a Jamaican to sing the verses, and then they will do the chorus. So to me, what that says is that there's a huge respect And people from those communities, they don't just expect themselves to learn French. They expect you to learn some Haitian. They expect you to learn some Jamaican. I mean, if you're going to be with them and you're going to be talking to them, you learn it.
Precisely. Well, on that note, I see we're like about 30 minutes over our proposed ending time. But those persons who are on Facebook who didn't get a chance to ask a question, or the persons in the chat room now who didn't get a chance to ask a question, Kathian, Elano, and Patrice, I'm not sure if you have a question now. But guess what? There is going to be a second session today at 6 p.m. Right? Joanne, you have a comment? I see you raising your hand, Joanne. Okay, you're clapping your hands. Okay, right. But there's going to be a second session today at 6 p.m., 6 to 7 p.m. Deja will be coming back and she'll be looking at a game that she and her colleague are, I think it's a game based on a Creole, right, Deja? And there'll be poetry as well. We'll be hearing from poets across the region. At least 2 poets will be sharing their poetry, stories, sayings from the Caribbean region, and we're going to have a game on display. It's going to be streamed live once again on Facebook. Joanne, you have a quick comment or question? Just unmute your mic and go right ahead.
Patrice actually had a question.
Oh, Patrice, yes, go ahead, Patrice. Just unmute. I didn't see you raising your hand. So unmute and then ask.
I'll say it. She said, what would Dr. Weiner's experience be? Sorry, just when I'm on. What would Dr. Weiner's experience, just in general, with the Caribbean plays and the sort of language items that are captured? What's interesting? What are your experiences with the plays that you mentioned that you're editing, Lise, and the kind of language that you found, and what's been interesting and captivating and so on?
Well, I did learn a lot about language and culture from watching modern plays like Freddie Kissoon. These old texts, these old plays were prepared around 1838, and it's as Joseph asked, how do you find the links to the older forms? And what you're always looking for is missing links, that is intermediate forms between something you know now and something you maybe had before. Can you push it back? And one of the things is that, of course, you have a lot of archaic Creole language, but you also have archaic English language, or language that's military or governmental. So there's a lot to learn from them. There's a lot to learn. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to figure out how you would stage some of these things. Because in today's climate, I don't think you could stage these as they were originally proposed to be staged, with white people in blackface playing black characters. I don't know, maybe you could. Maybe you could do something different. I think it would be a very interesting exercise to work on these plays in today's country.
All right, thank you, Lise. And thanks for that question, Patrice. All right, so we're wrapping up now. Thank you for those of you who joined in. Thank you again, Peter and Lise, Joseph and Deidre, for participating in the first ever virtual language festival for the Society for Caribbean Linguistics. It will definitely not be the last. You know, we will try to make this an ongoing thing. And for those of you who didn't catch the entire session on Facebook, we're going to upload it to our brand new YouTube page. So many things going on. Oh my goodness, right?
So Instagram, we're on Instagram too.
We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter,
Facebook group, Facebook page.
Listen, we're going to find a way to beam SCL into your dreams. You watch and see, right? We're going to be everywhere.
I just wanted also to say that because we couldn't have a full face-to-face and even virtual conference, that we plan to invite other plenary speakers incrementally over time and spread it out over the next 2 years, actually, because when we have the live face-to-face one in Trinidad and Tobago in 2022, we'll be so well versed in all this digital stuff that by then it will be both face-to-face and virtual. But in the meantime, this is, I think, a wonderful start. I personally want to thank Clive and everybody on the exec, and of course, Alison Johnson and Huron Works, who have been helping us with all the social media publicity and support and so on, and giving us our new image and our new look. We have a brand new website coming up too, Clive. So that's really important. A fabulous website. We're honoring our honorary members in a special way. We'll have Member of the Month. We'll have sociolinguistic and other linguistic country profiles, etc. That's coming soon. But just to say that everybody out there who is looking forward to giving a talk, just let us know. We'll start scheduling and all the way up to 2022. And then we'll have a big real live and virtual celebration on our 50th anniversary. It's a big deal. SCL 1972. We'll be 50 years old. Looking forward to the next half century and beyond. We'll meet on Dingoli and then we'll Ramaji. Well,
I'm young enough to be around for the next half century, so hey.
Yay! You know. I hope not.
In my 60s by then. Anyway, so right. Thank you all for joining. We're going to end the meeting now. Come back later on. You know, you'll learn a game, you'll listen to poetry, you'll hear proverbs, you'll hear sayings. So we're looking forward to seeing you at the session at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Jamaica time.
For those of us who are numerically challenged, just tell us how many hours that is.
From now?
Yes.
It's going to be another 3.5 hours.
Okay.
From right now. If you're watching right now, another 3.5 hours from right now, we'll be doing another session. And that session will be a shorter session, an hour, at most 90 minutes. We'll be playing games, doing poetry and so on. And there's going to be...
Is this available only through Facebook?
Well, yes, that's the only platform that we're going to stream it live. If you want, you could rejoin on Zoom later on. So that's up to you as well, Lise. All right.
Same link,
right? Same link. All right, everybody, take care. Keep safe. Wear your mask. Stay inside. Do what you need to do. And looking forward to seeing some of you at the second session or even tomorrow for the final day.